If you spent any amount of time watching anime, you've surely seen some OPs and EDs, and as you've been watching them, you've no doubt seen those giant lists of Japanese text playing over the imagery and the music. But here's a question. Have you ever stopped and taken the time to consider just what all those credits are or what they could possibly mean? What is an animation producer? What is the difference between a director and a chief director? Is there even a difference between those two things? What is involved in the color design process? What the heck do people mean when they say key animation? Who are the people who actually make this stuff? The more anime that I've watched over the course of my life, the more curious I've become about anime as an actual created product. In part because I've been very fortunate to have conversations with people both in the industry itself and those who have the ability to gain access to worthwhile information about what goes on in anime production, I feel it important to help spread this information in the hope that even if in just a small way, anime fans can become more aware of what is involved in making the media that they love. I mean, I'm assuming that's why you clicked this video, right? So during this video, I'm going to be walking through every single major anime staff position that I can think of, and more specifically, what that job entails in the animation production pipeline. We'll be looking at a lot of materials, including some things that show just how involved and in-depth some of these jobs can get. We'll also be getting into some of the complications that may arise during production. One thing to keep in mind is that every single studio and individual production has their own inner workings that might be slightly different compared to what I say here. Some of the credits you may see could have different names but serve the same general function, and considering how much anime exists in the universe and has yet to be made, I cannot possibly account for every single credit that exists. However, what I hope this video does provide is a solid foundational starting point for anyone who might want some help figuring out just how all the various people involved in anime production carry out their respective jobs. For the sake of organization and convenience, this video is going to be divided between 4 categories: production, design, animation, and post-production. Some of these staff positions that I'll be talking about don't quite fit into one phase so cleanly, so keep that in mind as we move forward. Sadly, the playbook for anime production is anything but clean. However, let's start at the actual beginning with those who most work behind the scenes when it comes to getting anime started. Before you can even think about animating that magical girl transformation sequence that you've always wanted to, there's a whole slew of people who are involved in getting the gears turning. Planning, or kikaku. If you're going to produce an anime of some kind, you're going to need to get a plan in place, sometimes referred to in credits under such names as production generalization, planning producer, or production committee. This is the primary governing body of companies and people investing in the anime production. As a potential sampling, the original creator of the source material, their editor, the TV studio, companies such as Kadokawa or Aniplex, the animation studio executives and their associated producers, advertisers, those in charge of overseas licensing, a record label, a seiyuu agency, and a merchandising company may be perfectly reasonable bodies in planning. During the course of the planning, the copyright ownership of the anime is more than likely established, along with the setting of the budget, which I'll talk about later. Several of the production's roles, such as the director, series composer, art director, and others are also selected and usually sit in on these meetings. Because there are many companies that are involved in production committees, each comes to the anime with a particular goal or mindset in place for what the anime should include or comprise. As an example, let's say that you have an anime that takes place in a high school setting. I know, that's such a revolutionary concept. As the merchandising company gets familiar with the original character designs and then eventually the designs in the adaptation, they may want to suggest some additional designs for the characters to wear so that they can create figurines for sale. Or perhaps, to take it a step further, they may strongly suggest adding a beach episode or a swimsuit segment, or extending one within the source material because it will leave a stronger impact on viewers so that they'll be more inclined to purchase the new figurines. Meanwhile, the animation studio wants to work with a particular musical group that's gotten rather popular recently, like YOASOBI, to do the OP or ED sequence. but because they cannot secure the funding that the group's agency charges, or Yoasobi is unavailable, they have to look elsewhere. And then on top of that, NHK doesn't want the anime to air at a particular time slot because they feel that the content may not be appropriate for children, which could impact viewership and ratings. Or, if that's not the problem, maybe they won't grant the requested time slot because a show that they anticipated is going to be more popular has taken that place instead. And are there any other studios that will be consulted for outsourcing? How much time will the anime be given before it starts airing? On top of all of that, how much of the original source material is the anime going to cover? The point is that in the midst of the planning or production committee, numerous expectations and restrictions are placed on the production, and it is their approval that manages to get the anime off the ground. All of these details need to be hashed out before any further steps can be taken. This is partially why sometimes some announced adaptations ultimately do not coalesce. During the midst of the planning period, the studio is not able to generate enough interest in the show after its initial announcement, so it dies before it can be fully realized, or there are creative disagreements that make the project ultimately unsalvageable. Contrary to popular belief, an anime being announced does not automatically mean that the planning period is finished and that things have the green light to get started. Typically, an anime studio has about 6 to 8 months to work on creating an anime, so don't assume that, for instance, an anime announced to start airing 1.5 years from now will actually be worked on for 1.5 years. The chance is more than likely that the studio is already scrambling to get several other things finished. As you might imagine, it's even worse for anime originals. Because they don't have any source material to draw upon, scrounging together a production committee willing to listen to their pitch is even harder than it would be otherwise. To give incentive for everyone to get on board, personal name recognition matters a great deal here, as names carry prestige and financial or corporate security. For example, according to Pony Canyon producer Ishiguro Tatsuya, the primary reason why Mayoiga was able to be greenlit at all was because the problem of director, series composer, and character designer had already been solved. Mizushima Tsutomu, Okuda Mari, and Naomi Ide, the former two especially, were asked to make the series possible, and they agreed. And that's how one of the mid-2010s oddest and unironically fun anime got started. While this might be a rather small detail in the grand scheme of things, the planning phase is also the period when the official name of the production team is decided upon. This can normally go one of two ways. The first and usual way is that the committee doesn't actually care what the production team is called and instead just adopts the name of the show and tacks on the word project or something similar to it. This is why, for instance, at the end of the OP sequence for Wonder Egg Priority, you get a rather simplistic name like WEP Project. The second and vastly more fun way is that the staff makes a joke out of it. Hence, if you check the credits for The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, they refer to themselves as the SOS Brigade, even taking it a step further with credits like Brigade Leader and Ultra Director. Does this indicate the quality of a product? Not particularly, but it's worth mentioning nonetheless. One other aspect worth exploring here, and a chance to break a common misconception, is budgeting. In anime discussions, it is often commented upon that when a show starts looking terrible or has some moments that begin to look increasingly janky, it's the result of the budget running out, or to phrase it another way, that they ran out of money. I'm going to get more into this once we reach the part that deals with the animation process itself, but more often than not, it's less an issue of the show's budget running out and more a case of the show running out of time with a deadline approaching, or not having the necessary personnel. Sometimes, however, it is a case of the production not having enough money to make use of everything that it could, as was the reported case for the recent Nukitashi the Animation, according to a tweet by Kumata727, assuming that it is true. But the bottom line is, it's within the planning phase of anime that a lot of the decisions that impact things move forward are made behind closed doors, which is why it also tends to be one of the phases most in need of clarification. Production Assistant/Manager, or Seisaku Shinko. Production Assistant/Manager, or PA, is among the lowest ranks of production, but they're one of the most crucial staff members that keep everything moving in some kind of fashion. Think of them like the concrete on the sidewalk that provides a walkable foundation, or plugging the holes in the dam to stop it from bursting altogether. Production assistants have numerous jobs that they are tasked with, among which include personally delivering materials from group to group, because even well into the digital age, many materials are still exchanged in person as physical paper. And yes, this does mean sometimes spending agonizing hours in the car or on trains when, with each burning second, something new could be going wrong. Communicating deadlines or production notes with animators, finding replacement animators in case the animators at the studio cannot get the job done or go uncommunicative, or whatever other task is needed. You can imagine the sheer number of hours either in phone calls or glued to email screens pleading or waiting for responses. To put it another way, the production assistant is the facilitator of all core communication on the episode between the various entities, and often is also sitting in on meetings with their bosses, which I'll get to next, or helping in any other miscellaneous way that I didn't specify. As abjectly stressful as it can get, they thankfully are not alone in their ranks. Typically, a production will have several production assistants that each handle a certain number of episodes. When one episode of theirs is done, they immediately move on to the next one, assuming that they're not having to juggle multiple episodes at one time. But the fact is, with how fast and haphazard productions can get, they're more than likely working on 3 to 4 episodes at a given time. There is no defined practice for how the episodes are grouped together for a production assistant's responsibility, but they tend to be spaced out by every 3 or so episodes. For example, on a 12-episode television run of an anime, a production assistant may be involved in managing episodes 1, 4, and 7, and share the same staff on all 3 episodes. If you want to understand just how intense and brutal being a production assistant can be, a good anime for this would be Shirobako, directed by Mizushima Tsutomu. The main character, Miyamori Aoi, works as a production assistant throughout the course of the show's first 12 episodes, and if you watch it, you'll quickly understand why all those donuts and beer may rapidly become a production assistant's best friend. Also, Shirobako is just in general an absolutely amazing show, even beyond its educational value, and I implore you to watch it as soon as you've closed this video out. Production Desk, or Seisaku Tanto. Production Desk, also possibly called Production Administrator or Chief Manager, can best be thought of as production assistants who are higher on the corporate ladder, sometimes referred to as line producers in Western terminology, though this can also apply to PAs. While the production assistants tend to be the ones running around and putting out the various fires, the production desk helps with allocating the show's budget, filling out progress reports, sitting in on meetings with their own superiors at the studio, and managing the overall schedule to see what is or is not on track properly. The production assistants report to them as the person who oversees and appoints their work. It is a common roadmap that production assistants eventually move on to become production desk or even higher up in the production hierarchy if they want to stay more behind the scenes. But for those who want to flex more creative ideas, it's also a possibility that production desk could lead to episode directing. Animation producer, or animation producer. The animation producer is perhaps the most important role on the production side, and one whose job should be more publicly known. Similar to the production desk, they are also in part responsible for meeting with executives, handling the schedule, and allocating budget. But more than that, they are also the person tasked with assembling the core animation staff with the director and helping to outline the expectations that the animators will need to work with. As an example, if you loved the sheer amount of aesthetic variety in Bocchi the Rock, you can thank Umehara Shota, or Umepi as he's also called, the animation producer from Cloverworks for that, as well as the general animation aesthetic for other Cloverworks projects he produced like My Dress-Up Darling Season 1, and how he desperately tried to salvage the ship as it ran into its various problems from those higher up on the corporate totem pole for Wonder Egg priority. His most recent credit is as the production desk for My Dress-Up Darling Season 2. To quote Mappa's Yuata Shuhei's tweet from 2021, cleaned up for grammatical purposes, quote, "It is certain that studios play a role in coordinating the environment for creative teams, but each and every staff member is much more important for the success. Gathering staff is largely due to the skills of animation producer, and the studio does not necessarily reflect that," end quote. The current age of webgen or freelance animators around the world has simultaneously helped and hurt the animation producer's job. On the one hand, they are a wealth of people who may be contacted in the event that they are needed, and since they're publishing their portfolios and work online on sites like Twitter, there's a lot to choose from and you don't necessarily need to reach out to contact them to see a sample. However, the animation producer may have to spend a fair amount of their time both on and off the clock scouring the internet to find out-of-country animators to help when the studio staff start getting overworked, presenting potential language and time zone barriers that might cause their own share of problems. Because there may be no proper vetting for these freelance creators, the animation producer may recruit someone whose animation work is not up to par with the rigor of what anime production proper demands, leaving the already overworked animators at the studio to spend time correcting or fixing sloppy work. Since freelance animators are not taught at anime studios in the same way that in-house animators are, assuming that even happens, which is another problem, freelancers often do not receive proper feedback about their animations in the process. Animation work, or animation seisaku. Animation work can be quite simply described as the main studio responsible for the production. In a sense, it's the clearest sign of which studio is putting their logo center stage and taking credit for the creation of the anime. It's what allows us as anime fans to say things like Hibike Euphonium is a Kyoto Animation production, or that the original Mobile Suit Gundam was a Sunrise production, or that Death Note was a Madhouse production. Animation work assistants, or animation seisaku kyoryoku. Unfortunately, most studios are not equipped to handle the rigor of creating a full 12-episode core of anime in the 6 to 8 months given to them by the planning committee. Either as part of the planning committee's design or through a series of circumstances that dictate it, more studios are needed to get the project completed on the animation front. As such, animation work assistants is any studio that has helped in this respect and may be thought of as the primary source for anime outsourcing. Two things to keep in mind in this respect. One is that the company listed under an animation work assistance credit may simply be a subsidiary or sub-branch of the main studio, as is the case when Kyoto Animation credits Animation Do in this way. Also, a reminder that just because something is outsourced, that does not necessarily mean that it is bad. Many anime of the past 60 years have been outsourced, whether that's more publicly known or not, and as I explained in my own series, Finding Kyoto Animation, that's how they themselves became known in the industry at first. It just so happens that in the current anime industry landscape, heavy outsourcing is at times a sign that things are not going well. For particularly big cases of studio outsourcing, such as entire episodes, you may see a studio given credit as gurosu. Producer, or producer. The producer role in anime is surprisingly frustrating. While the producer is not necessarily a person who impacts the creative endeavors in the day-to-day like an animation producer, production assistant, production desk, director, or animator does, they are a key component of the planning committee portion. The producer helps to organize and hopefully execute the contracts with the various other vendors on the production committee, the initial conditions of the animation studio's rate of profit and other budgetary matters, outlining who the anime's target audience is, finding a director, and numerous other tasks that don't involve the creative process itself. For example, Maruyama Masao is one of the most famous producers in the history of the medium, having helped form Studio Madhouse in the 1970s and MAPPA in the 2010s, which is a chief reason why those studios had their own periods of high achievement. He was willing to take a chance on many creators if he thought their creative ideas were worthwhile, like Kon Satoshi, whose work is routinely praised for both their ideas and respective visual identities. Executive producer, or seisaku soshiki. To contrast with the producer role, the executive producer is the person most relied upon for their monetary contributions. The primary person who really helps to bring in potential investors. They are not necessarily employed by the anime studio, often coming from an outside company, but because they are one of the most important ringleaders to getting the ball rolling in the first place, they can be thought of as the person who does the largest overall contribution to the production committee's business startup. Director, or kantoku. When all the aspects, or constraints depending on how you want to think about it, have been established for the anime, or even during the midst of the planning committee itself, it is then determined who will step up as the director, or series director, either by volunteering or by the committee's decision. The director is, for all intents and purposes, the final authority behind every decision that is undertaken during the course of a production once things actually get underway. Very few things are carried out without their approval, supposedly, and production assistants and other directors and designers on the anime will often come to the director to check or catch things that might need more work. We'll get into that when we reach the animation portion of this video. Despite their position on the production, it's important to note that while the director does maintain some degree of latitude regarding what may happen, some of what they actually can do is limited by the planning or production committee. If, for instance, the committee wants more of a one-to-one adaptation of a pre-existing source material and wants to cover specific moments in the plot by episode 12 or by the end of the run, it is assumed that the director will have read the material enough to know not only the plot, the major characters, and overall themes or underwriting, but also recreate the original source as closely as possible. While it's true that some of the material's more iconic or familiar moments will be recreated or perhaps even praised for their fidelity, it sometimes makes for creatively lacking situations that don't properly utilize what animation is inherently capable of. For anime that are true originals, the director may be more proactively involved in the planning at the onset, helping not only pitch the anime as being worth pursuing, but also offering their own initial ideas for how to go about making this possible. Especially since no pre-existing material source exists, things such as a director's reputation, who they've already got in their corner both in-house and out-of-house willing to work on it prior to going into the meetings, and mapping out the anime's trajectory from beginning to end, including which episodes will require which resources, can be vital in securing approval. Because of the director's positioning as being the central figure concerning how the anime will ultimately look in the end, they generally tend to be the first person in the line of fire in the eyes of the anime community, and the planning committee as well, in the event that things start going awry either during the middle of production or when the episodes are completed and airing on television. On some level, the director cannot assume all responsibility for this happening, though. After all, it is true that the cinematic arts are an inherently collaborative effort unless you're making a one-person production. However, it is important to note that the director is the person tasked with making sure everything goes smoothly and that they can handle the responsibility therein. But, as we're going to learn, that's not always the case. Chief Director, or Sou Kantoku. The chief director is exactly what it sounds like, a director that ranks above the primary director, and therefore has stronger power in regards to what does or does not get approved during production. Depending on the production itself, the chief director may actually be the one who is calling most of the shots, while the episode director and director struggle to make deadlines or are too heavily preoccupied with stopping a hemorrhaging somewhere in the production. The problem is that sometimes the chief director is also meant to reflect a more advisory or supervisory role in production. The biggest example would easily be Shinbo Akiyuki. He did not, in fact, serve as the final authority for all of those credits in the Studio Shaft catalog where he was listed as the chief director. However, it would not be an exaggeration to say that, if there needed to be an extra set of hands or another brain to coordinate or juggle some responsibilities, he would have stepped in to assume those tasks to ensure a smoother production. Smoother, of course, does not imply smooth, but it would make things at least a little less rocky. Because of the sheer breadth of work or supervising that a chief director may have over a production, the only way to determine the barrier between chief director and regular series director is as information comes to light. As a general rule, I default to the mindset that a chief director is the supervisory position, while the series director is the one who is doing most of the work with the rest of the staff working on episodes. Episode director, or Enshutsu. In the simplest sense, the episode director is the person who is tasked with the directorial role over a single episode of anime, overseeing all the staff who are involved in that episode's production, as well as attending any relevant meetings with the other directors on the episode, like the art director, the director of photography, and so on, and having the final say in all the smaller decisions that go into making the episode. I'll get into this a little more in just a minute. The director or chief director is their immediate superior and does have the authority to overrule any decisions made, but the expectation is that while the director takes a more bird's-eye view of the whole production, the episode director's hyper-focus on one episode specifically helps the director manage all of this. It should be noted that the episode director also is in the line of fire in the economic sense when things start to go awry. Again, we'll be getting into the thick of this more in the animation section of the video as we break down that process piece by piece, but because the episode director has the responsibility to complete the episode within the allotted time and resources, they cannot afford to waste time and resources with too many extraneous details that could slow production down. Doing so balloons the effort of everyone involved in trying to get the episode done in time, and if the episode should go over budget or take too long, the episode director bears the responsibility of both explanation and reception to the episode if it fails as a result. Now, it's time to address what I mentioned before about those small decisions that go into making an episode. It's true that the episode director oversees the production of an episode and are involved in every major decision that goes into making it, but they still have the higher director's authority and approval to answer to. So, how much power does the episode director have? Well, that varies based on the production. Generally speaking, the relationship between the director and the episode director comes in one of two varieties. The first is that the episode director is tasked with carrying out the wishes and vision of the director to a T, not really straying from that, and therefore trying to give an overall aesthetic unity to the whole work. This is part of the reason why, despite a series having 12 episodes, it could feel like each episode was directed by the same person, such as a Dezaki Osamu anime, whose style is so distinct that it persists through every installment via traits such as, but not limited to, Dutch angles, split screens, and postcard memories, called harmonies in the anime industry. But on the other hand, there are certain productions where an episode director's input makes their specific episodes or sequences shockingly distinct in comparison to the rest of the show. Some of the episodes that come to mind are from Ashita no Naja from 2003, episode 26, which was directed by Hosoda Mamoru of Wolf Children and Summer Wars fame, using his penchant for theateresque blocking or shot composition in a way that gives both the episode a unique flavor and keeps the show's larger thematic and melodramatic undercurrent flowing. There is also Heavenly Delusion from 2023, episode 10, by Ikarashi Kai, in which the stylistic decisions made during the action stand in contrast to the rest of the series, but work nonetheless for the manner by which they were composed. Another notable example is all 3 episodes of Re Cutie Honey from 2004, in which all 3 of its episodes were separately directed by someone else. While Ano Hideaki was the chief director, Imaishi Hiroyuki directed episode 1, Nobuyuki Ito directed episode 2, and both Ano and Masayuki co-directed episode 3. But in a time-tested example of how an episode director's input can really showcase their abilities in realizing something comes with the Endless 8 from The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya's second season. Like with Re Cutie Honey, every episode of the arc was directed by someone different, and it's worth taking the time to explore how they all took the same overall plot and realized it in different ways via camera positioning, color design, lighting and compositing, music detail, etc. I'll no doubt talk about that more when I get to that point of the Finding Kyoto Animation series on this channel, which you should go watch, but what I hope I'm making clear is that the episode director's freedom and control are production and director dependent, as well as the natural needs that arise during the midst of the production as it gets going proper. This also applies to whether there is a series episode director or chief episode director, and how they might be involved either as hands-on or advisor, changing from production to production. If there's any thesis to take away from this whole spiel about episode directors, it's that the role of episode director can be very difficult to pin down, especially as the hierarchical structure of an anime gets more and more convoluted. This is why I had to say at the top, in the simplest sense, because the truth is that it is oftentimes not quite as black and white as we'd like it to be. Sadly, details about productions are not as forthcoming as we'd like, especially in regards to translated material, so we have to make the best guesses that we can based on the information that we do have. Unit director, or enshutsu? Wait, didn't I already say that? The unit director can be thought of as the movie equivalent of an episode director. Rather than directing an episode of a TV anime, the unit director oversees directing a portion of the movie that could be thought of as an act in a play or a musical, or of a particular section that constitutes a significant length of the movie's runtime, like a quote-unquote episode of the film. Two important things to note are that unit director is often still written as an episode director credit, such as on screen here in the credits for Kyoto Animation's Liz and the Bluebird. As a result, unit director and episode director are sometimes used interchangeably both within the medium and within conversation. Contrary to what you may have been told, the unit director does not automatically imply the people who directed OPs and EDs, even though the term is sometimes used in this manner. Series composer / series composition, or shirizu kosei. Although the term composer or composition implies something musical, the series composer on an anime production actually refers to the primary figure in charge of helping the director start drafting and shaping the story and its arcs. Ideally, they will be a part of the early production meetings with the director and committee in order to get things started on the smoothest note possible. Once that occurs, the series composer will take that general draft and start making decisions about how to split it into the total number of episodes, and often with the director's final approval. I say ideally before because sometimes this is not the case. For certain productions, the series composer is brought rather late into the planning and therefore is more or less forced to follow the planning committee or director's roadmap for what the project is supposed to entail, perhaps not even having the agency to help dictate how the episodes are going to be split. As you might imagine, in situations like these, the series composer has very little power of their own, and since the director outranks them positionally, it's not a role that affords much freedom of writing invention. In terms of who is actually writing the episodes of the anime themselves, the series composer does write a fair number of episodes, if not most or all, depending on the production. At other times, guest writers may also be brought in with their own ideas if the series allows for that sort of thing. Here's an example of what I mean. On Princess Tutu, Yokoto Michiko served as the series composer, but that show also had several different scriptwriters, such as Chiaki J. Konaka of Serial Experiments Lain fame, as well as Ikeda Mamiko, who was the series composer for the first 103 episodes of Sergeant Frog. With chief director Junichi Sato's history of serving as director for over 60 episodes of Sailor Moon, and in charge of Princess Tutu, it's likely that he gave the writers the chance to get a little creative with how they perceive the show's sense of drama. On the topic of anime originals, it's important to stress that although they are the main position behind the laying out of the story, the series composer does not always mean that they are the person who created the original story. This is why you will sometimes see original story or author as a credit being given to someone else rather than the series composer. In this case, the series composer helps take the original story creator's ideas and crystallizes them into the episodes and overall arc of the show. Script, or kyakuhon. The script credit is exactly what it sounds like, the person who is in charge of writing the script for the episode, based on the framework outlined by the series composer after the production meetings have been finished and finalized. The script is a vital piece that will help make the storyboard portion of the animation process go smoothly, but we'll get to that in just a minute. Director of Photography / Compositing Director, or Satsue Kantoku. Director of Photography is a term that has a bit of a holdover from a period of time when rostrum cameras were actually used during the course of making anime. Unless you're making something like City the Animation, which involves incorporating real-life footage, such as the diorama from episode 5, cameras are a thing of the past when it comes to anime production. We'll delve a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of what this job really entails in the final section when we talk about post-production and compositing proper, but as cliff notes, the Director of Photography oversees the photography, or as it's also called, the compositing department, which has two chief jobs. First, they oversee the inclusion of any visual effects, lighting, or filters that make their way into the final product. I say oversee because the director themselves rarely assumes the responsibility of correcting the files. Second, they are the ultimate person in charge of the production's technical design by addressing questions of how to do filtering, gradients, effect composition, etc. Adobe After Effects is used as the program of choice not only for its overall utility, but also because of its ease of access. So for those of you who like making home movies, congratulations, you might be using the same exact program as professional anime studios. Since most anime only have one director of photography working on a series or film at a given time, they will often rely upon an assistant director of photography to help juggle the many pieces. Art Director, or Bijutsu Kantoku. The title Art Director is perhaps a little bit misleading. It might make it appear as though they're in charge of all the art on a production and how it looks, but their role is thankfully not so all-encompassing as that. The art director, during the course of the pre-production phase, helps design all the backgrounds, much like the series director fashioning the overall structure of the TV anime script-wise over the span of its 12 to 14 episode run. The art director creates the artboards, which, when approved by the director, help serve as the primary reference material for the environment of the anime. While it's true that the episode's individual background art is done by another role altogether, which I'll discuss in the design phase of the video coming up shortly, the art director helps check that the backgrounds are accurate to the overall vision for the project. One shortcutting technique that happens to be quite handy for art directors is that, because so much anime takes place in Japan, and especially high school settings, streets, mountains, buildings, and overall scenery of the country makes for convenient backdrops for the backgrounds. Of course, the problem that comes with this is that a Japanese audience will be able to recognize when a hill doesn't exist in the supposed place the anime takes place in, so the verisimilitude of using real-life locations is something that the art director must keep in mind. You don't want to accidentally mix up the backgrounds of Tokyo with Yokohama. Music, or ongaku. Music, in this case, refers to the primary composer of the music in the course of an anime. For as much as we like to think that composers write the most amazing pieces ever as though they came from heaven, this is hardly the case, especially for a narrative-driven piece of entertainment that may require dozens of pieces long and short. Having the composer start from zero, or the most bare-bones framework of what the show involves or needs, is rather cruel. As such, during the course of music production, a composer may be sent a series of pre-existing works that illustrate the kind of feel or similarity that the studio wants to evoke or utilize for the purposes of their anime. Because each production requires its own general soundscape, the hired composer needs to be well versed enough in the music that the studio wishes to use. For example, a fantasy anime may require a bombastic soundtrack, so the composer is sent appropriate samples that reflect the proper tone of bombast that is needed, or for a more quiet and contemplative anime, they may be sent more aleatoric or mood-driven pieces. If there is a character with a particular personality, the production might send samples to the composer to evoke the same sensibility they want for that character's theme. Because of all this exchanging of musical material, if you hear anime music that sounds vaguely similar to something you've heard somewhere else, the chance is far less likely that it's musical copyright infringement, especially given how litigiously happy Japanese companies can be, and more likely that it involves direct inspiration as given by those assisting the composer. Depending on the production itself, the composer may be asked to compose away from the anime visually, as the music is then matched later to what transpires in the show. On the surface, this approach seems a little counterintuitive, but as we're about to learn when we get to the animation portion of the process, scenes often are not finished in a clean, linear manner. Because of this, the composer cannot afford to waste time waiting to see a finished product to start composing, especially if changes are needed down the line. Music director, or ongaku director. While the composer may be the person responsible for writing all the music that will be used during the course of the production, the music director helps make larger-scale decisions as the soundtrack is being assembled or completed. Some of these decisions include, but are not limited to, whether certain aspects of the music need to be rewritten, where exactly the music should be placed in a scene, whether more music is needed, and so on. These discussions hopefully include both the director and the episode director, and may also include discussions with the sound team or others who may be more proactively involved in the handling of either the whole production or particular episodes. Any relevant changes that need to be made to the music itself are sent to the composer, who then reports back once they've been finished. When the soundtrack is okayed and has been orchestrated, it's given to the hired musicians who then record it for the studio to implement in editing. Whew, well, that was a lot, and we're only just getting started, so let's move on to the design phase. Character designer, or kyarakuta design. The character designer is the person who, as the name implies, designs the characters in the anime. Depending on whether they are working on an original production or something that is adapting prior material, some of the responsibilities will be a little bit different. For an anime adaptation, it is not simply a matter of copying and pasting the designs for the sete. It's important to remember that things like manga, light novels, and visual novels are often reliant on still images for their storytelling conveyance, and since anime is produced in a format that is meant to accommodate televisions and, most significantly, movement, the character designer does not have the luxury of simply making minor tweaks. They need to extrapolate all the available information on a character's design into this new medium, resizing or making other larger aesthetic decisions to better complement the overall tone or production schedule, all while making something that will look appealing when in motion. Making adaptations naturally limits what the character designer is able to do, since fans will expect a particular blueprint to be followed. But some productions, such as the 2 adaptations of Maho Sensei Negima in the 2000s, offered some different looks on the character designs. For anime originals, the character designer often will help conceptualize the characters with the director or whoever pitched the original story. There's obviously a lot more freedom in the realm of anime originals, but the bulk of the work a character designer will be doing is adapting. There are numerous sete that the character designer is tasked with creating. Oftentimes, character design sheets will include a lineup with many of the characters facing the front so that their height relationships may be clearly defined. All of the characters likewise have their own set of sete pages. Among the more common ones seen include a front, rear, and profile perspective on the character, close-ups of the characters' faces as they make some of their more expressive faces, which, for example, allow the details on the hair to be highlighted, recurring alt character designs like chibis or similar, or characters posing with objects that they are commonly seen using, or riding if it's a vehicle. All the relevant character sete are sent out to the relevant departments as they start constructing the anime proper. Sete quite often feature notes about particular accessories or features that make the character unique, indicated as such on the page. The character designer may have an idea about a character's or characters' color profile, but that tends to be handled by the next position we'll be talking about. Color designer / color stylist, or shikisai sete or shikisai sekkei. Because we live in a post-Kimba the White Lion phase of anime production, most anime, except for exceptions such as Uzumaki, are produced with color in mind rather than grayscale. As such, the color designer is the person most in charge of taking command for how a show's overall color palette looks, especially in regards to the characters. Common questions that the color designer could need to address are, is the overall color of the show light or dark? How should the characters complement or contrast this? Do the colors match the character's personality, and if not, is it for the purposes of being ironic or something else? Which hues or shades of color should be emphasized? How will these colors integrate or stand out against the backgrounds? The color designer's job often involves creating color model sheets of the characters, which draw upon the character design sete as a frame of reference. These model sheets articulate not only the colors to be used, but also indicate the various parts of the characters' bodies to show what goes where in the actual coloring process, along with any other relevant notes or suggestions. Back in the earlier days of anime production, it was assumed that the art director would be the primary person tasked with forming the color design. And this makes sense. As the person in charge of helping to devise the visual aesthetic of the backgrounds, they would presumably also have input into the overall color palette employed for them, which would likewise carry into the middle ground and foreground layers. The idea is that there is a conceptualized spectrum as envisioned by either one person or a very small number of people. However, as is the case with so many other components of anime production, and we haven't even hit on actual animating yet, that has now been designated to another role altogether, the color designer. As such, there is a major collaboration and communication between the color designer and art director and their respective departments, especially for an individual episode's color coordinator or background artist, respectively. Though I remarked that Uzumaki was a series that used grayscale rather than color, that does not mean that there is no color designer for the project. There are 2 credited color designers for the anime, Sawa and Umezaki Hiroko. In rare cases like these, the color designers have to envision how the black, white, and gray hues of the characters complement each other so that they don't stand out as poorly integrated against the background, foreground, and middle ground layers. The photography department might be able to help mitigate some of this, but the first line of defense in these respects is the color designer. Color coordinator, or iroshite. The color coordinator, while not as major a role as the overall color designer, is nevertheless a key component of the art department, often handing out the color designer's color model sheets to the other artists ranked below them. There might also be circumstances where the color coordinator provides their own unique color model sheets that are not necessarily based on the color designer's palette construction. This usually happens in a couple of specific instances, such as, but not limited to, the color designer not having done a color model sheet for a one-off character, prop, or other such property that is unique to their episode, and therefore not a continuous part of the larger overall color tapestry, or an episode in which the color palette is deliberately different or meant to stand apart from the show's general color sensibility. Such decisions are never unilaterally decided upon by the color coordinator, though, as their decisions and overall work are checked by the color designer, the episode director, and the director. At least, you hope that's the case. Background/background artist, or haike. Like I said before, the art director is the person who is in charge of designing the backgrounds or environments of the show, but it is the individual episode's background artist that has to go about following those blueprints and notes to create them into something that can be sent to the animators and compositing. Despite the fact that every episode will certainly have a background artist or artists credited, not every studio is equipped to have their own dedicated art department that can handle a full 12 to 14 episode run or a movie. Even a superstar studio like Kyoto Animation needs to sometimes rely on outsourcing in order to cover them. As a result, background art is one of the aspects that you might notice in the visual component that might seem flatly designed, covered by the studio's compositing department with gradients or effects to mask this. Again, just to reiterate, outsourcing is not in and of itself a bad thing. It's just that it sometimes is the explanation for why something is not quite as put together as it could be. Prop design, or puroppu design. Prop design in this case refers to any objects which tend to be thought of as accessories or other relatively common items that a character would reasonably hold or interact with. Think things like purses, cell phones, pencils, water bottles, books, or essentially anything that could be chalked up to miscellaneous items that are not of particularly grand significance design-wise. Mechanical design, or mekanikusette. The mechanical designer's primary job is to design some of the more technological aspects of what might be in an anime. If you've ever been impressed by the way that a mecha or a sleek car looks, you can thank the mechanical designer for providing much of the necessary visual detail for this. As you might imagine, in certain kinds of stories like cyberpunk, spacefaring science fiction, or even steampunk or dieselpunk, the mechanical designer's input makes a healthy contribution to selling the world as a lived-in environment. Like the character or prop designer's work, the amount of detail from varying angles of the fully realized object and the numerous components it may comprise gives the animators valuable information in terms of both construction and scale, as well as how these pieces are meant to interact if it involves more fine-tuned movement in the doga stage. In essence, you can sort of think of it as mechanical sette. Well, now that all the designs are ready to go, it's about time that we finally start getting to animating. Simple, right? Animation, or genga. Animation is genga. The end. Okay, so that's not really the end. This section, while still chapter divided, is going to be very messy because there's a lot of moving parts all happening simultaneously, and as I'm about to show, many of these parts overlap and collide together. But let's start with some more directorial positions. Animation Director, or Sakuga Kantoku, or Sakan. The animation director, at its simplest, is the person responsible for making sure that all of the animation in the course of an episode is of quality. This comes not only by hopefully checking the various cuts and layouts that come their way, but also in the course of offering corrections, called shusei, on the drawings before they go higher up the directorial chain for further checks. I'll get into that more later, but one thing that needs to be clarified up front is that the term animation director is a bit of a misnomer. In the course of the video so far, the term director has been used for various positions that involve proactive involvement in the creative process, making a lot of decisions overhead while the others are in the weeds creating the anime. This doesn't quite happen to the animation director position. Their role is far closer to that of an animation supervisor, so even though the word kantoku, which implies director, is used in the animation director credit, just bear that in mind as an inconsistency between the various director positions. Speaking of consistency, that's the magic word that best explains the animation director's job, especially in regards to character design. During the course of producing an anime, it is rarely just one animator who is working on an episode, and often not just one animator working on an individual scene. A scene may have 3 or 4 animators apiece, each tasked with animating certain cuts within that scene. No matter how much the animators may follow the sette from the character designer and try to keep the proper perspective or sense of scale, certain things like mouth or eye positioning, hairstyle, or other things of that nature might inadvertently go unpolished or be in the wrong place. Therefore, the animation director's primary job is to ensure that from cut to cut within the course of an episode, there is a consistent cohesion aesthetically to make it appear as though it were all animated by one person. Of course, deliberate tone shifts, like a chibi scene in a comedy or something meant to stand apart, requires a different type of consistency, but the animation director nevertheless is responsible for this as well. Circumstances like these are often clarified with the episode director and the director in conversation with the animation director, and while it does not happen very often, it would not be completely unreasonable to assume that the rulebook is thrown out altogether in exchange for a creative explosion. It should also be mentioned that there may be multiple specialized animation directors during the course of an episode. Mechanical director, effects director, food director, the list can go on. One of my personal favorites is Bear Animation Director, or Kumasakan, from Ikuhara Kunihiko's Yurikuma Arashi. Point being, it is not unreasonable to assume that, depending on the need of the production, a particular animation director credit will be on production to make sure that the individual components are, hopefully, polished accordingly. Chief Animation Director, or Sousakuga Kantoku, or Sousakan. Despite having a similar name to the hard-to-pin-down Chief Director position that I discussed previously, the Chief Animation Director is a more easily defined role. Best thought of as the overall series animation supervisor, they help keep the consistency and cohesion to all the series animation directors. This matters because, despite the increase in anime being produced and created, along with production schedules getting increasingly crunched, this has not quite been met by a proportionate rise in talented animators. Because of this, more people are needed to be brought on board to ensure an anime's consistency. In the old days, a single animation director per episode was all that you might need, but because the current system of anime production was established in the 1960s with Mushi Productions' model and has only been majorly updated by the production for Heidi, Girl of the Alps from 1974 with the advent of the layout system, which I'll explain later in the layout section, the solution was not to scale back the number of productions to ensure better quality overall. Instead, additional supervisor roles were added to try and deal with the in-studio problems concerning animation. Therefore, episodes having more than one animation director necessitated the need to have someone oversee consistency within individual episodes so that wires don't get crossed between various animation directors. After all, more animation directors means more opportunities for the quality to deviate since they might give different or inconsistent corrections. Thus, we have the Chief Animation Director, the supervisor's supervisor. The work they oversee has already been checked or corrected as needs be, at least you hope so the actual correcting work by the Chief Animation Director is less than it is for the Animation Director. This subsequently gives the Chief Animation Director more episodes to work on. Much like the animation directors, a lot of the correcting work that a Chief Animation Director would focus on is the character designs. In a normal world, this would therefore beg the question of why doesn't the character designer just do it? Perhaps a character designer would step in to do corrections, though it's not likely, though they'd be responsible for overseeing dozens of episodes over multiple months. So how did the industry solve this potential problem? Well, if you've looked at anime credits recently, you may notice that episodes may have multiple chief animation directors, supervisors for the supervisor's supervisors. It's a mess. Because there are now so many directors and animation directors working on an anime, being able to tell who is giving which corrections matters. To help with this, assuming that the production assistant is not emailing the directions or digital files, correction forms, or shusei-yoshi, come in varying colors to let the animator or artist know who above them is saying what needs to be corrected. There is no universally agreed upon standard for which color is which, but as a general rule, yellow or orange paper belongs to the animation director, green or light green belongs to the chief animation director, and episode directors or directors might use red, pink, peach, skin, or salmon-colored sheets. The problem is that in the modern industry, anyone who is able to draw gets sent the corrections, so an animator might not even be able to correct their own corrections, as it is usually the animation director who handles those. If you're raising your eyebrow at the idea that an animator might not be able to fix their own work and thus consciously improve, congratulations, you've hit on one of the foundational problems plaguing the industry right now. I wish someone would correct it. And of course, this does not take into account the fact that, depending on the production, there will be other types of corrections sent to specific people on the pipeline, such as someone who does mecha checks, perhaps the mechanical designer, or someone in charge of the effects. There are, again in theory, many steps to help prevent animation mistakes from creeping in, but with production crunch and the continued fracturing of the industry, these systems to catch errors and mistakes are vanishing or getting more sloppy. In reality, the checks and corrections sent from directors, episode directors, and animation directors are handled by whoever is able to handle it, so it's likely that as many as 5 people, if not more, worked on that one cut of characters walking to school. Storyboard, or ekonte. The storyboarder is the person in charge of creating the storyboards for an episode. Essentially the foundation for what an anime episode will look like, the storyboard is the first major component that goes into the visual identity for the episode. A typical anime storyboard looks something like this, with each column divided into several sections, though the order might be slightly different depending on the studio. From left to right, they are the specific number of the cut during the course of the episode, and may also include the scene number, along with which numbered cut in the scene takes place, the sketch, which represents roughly what the shot is supposed to look like, notes that the staff should pay attention to when it comes time to animate the shot properly, details like effects that are present, camera positioning and movement, etc., the pertinent dialogue and/or sound effects, as well as the timing or length of each cut. The number in the time section, such as 3 plus 0, indicate how many seconds plus how many frames the cut is supposed to last for, with 24 frames per second in anime. Why 24 FPS when we can currently go up to 60? It's a question of practicality. Asking an animator to animate something at 60 FPS yields increasingly diminishing returns despite any extra smoothness that might be included. Not to mention that trying to artificially upscale animation often looks, well, kind of bad. This is why I hate OP or ED videos that are given the UHD or AI upscale treatment, but that's another topic for another time. The storyboard piece matters not just because it offers the blueprint for what the anime will look like, but it also marries the episode's script from the scriptwriter or series composer into something visually workable. Not every single sequence in an episode will necessarily be captured in a storyboard, at least at first. A common example is that occasionally you will see the word bank appear in a storyboard, which means that the episode or the scene will be actively reusing footage from previously aired episodes, basically drawing upon the show's bank of footage in order to make that happen. Shows with repeated transformation sequences like Sailor Moon or Digimon, or other shows which rely upon the characters doing the same repeated motions like in Pokémon, are cases where this would happen. There may be other circumstances which involve cuts that are not initially storyboarded, but these tend to be rarer, like when an animator is specifically hired to create something, and receive particular credit for doing so in the episode's ED. When all is said and done, an episode may contain hundreds of pages worth of storyboards, even more than that depending on how action-intensive the cut might be, and every single one should be, but not necessarily are, checked by the episode director and director before being approved. There has been a bit of a push to have storyboards be done on digital files for time saving and ease of communication. But since so many storyboarders tend to be the oldest staff members who go into making the episode proper, it doesn't make for the smoothest transition into the digital age. Because anime storyboards are the most skeletal blueprint for creating animation, they do not need to be the most hyper-detailed pieces of the animation process, visually speaking. However, there are certain individuals whose storyboarding work could be an art unto itself, capturing such intensive detail that the animating process becomes recreating the storyboard as closely as possible. Kon Satoshi, for example, is well known for his highly detailed storyboards, while others such as Imaishi Hiroyuki are less about the visual pristineness and more about articulating and communicating the tone for the needed framework. And sometimes you'll get this from Murata Masahiko on Naruto Shippuden episode number 474, where the lack of detail is more an indication that the staff is already familiar with how the storyboarder works and communicates. I bring this up because it would be very easy to say that the visually detailed storyboards are, quote, better by default, unquote. But there are many things that go into a good storyboard besides the initial visual image. A good storyboard is determined by how well it communicates what it needs the animators to do, as it is the job of the actual animators to take the storyboard and realize them in more vivid, moving details later. And it's the lack of good communication that can absolutely capsize an episode early on. If the cuts aren't storyboarded in a way that makes logical sense, or the directors from the storyboarders to the animation staff are unclear, or if the animator just decides to completely ignore the storyboarder's instructions, which is sadly not that uncommon for younger animators just starting to get into the industry and learning how the industry process works, things can already get hamstrung and glitch up. Keep in mind, an episode only has so much time to get done before the wicked delay the episode question arises. In an ideal situation, the episode or series director and the storyboarder working on that same episode are the same person. This makes sense. The person who would be tasked with communicating effectively to the animators would likewise be the person in charge, the person who has enough creative sensibility to put pencil to paper their ideas. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say stylist to screen. However, in the tightening grip of production deadlines, as well as an episode director simply not having the creative acumen or background to be able to do so, storyboarders are increasingly not sharing the same role as episode director. The new adaptation of Spice and Wolf is a perfect example of this in action, with 12 different credited storyboarders to work on 25 episodes of anime, and 19 different credited episode directors, with several episodes having 2 or 3 episode directors apiece in order to get things done on time. Layout, or Realto. When the storyboard has hopefully been approved by the director or episode director, the question then arises of who exactly is supposed to handle which scene. At this point, the production assistants meet with the team of animators recruited for their particular episodes, either designating who will work on animating which storyboards or asking for volunteers. Once all assignments have been given, if further assistance is needed, freelancers may be contacted either from the internet, which is how many freelancers wanting to get into the industry get their first jobs, or from other in-country animators working at other studios. However, animating properly begins in the layout phase. A piece of blank layout paper looks something like this, though again, there might be slight differences between studios. The sections are the title of the show and/or the cut number, a hole punch guide to align the layouts together, a space for the artist's name, and the time of the cut written in seconds and frames just like the storyboard. The large rectangle that takes up most of the layout is divided between different portions. The thick black border is called the frame, and acts as the boundary that reflects what is seen in animation, so anything beyond this boundary is cut off. The frame's inner rectangle, either a lighter hue or dotted, is a so-called safe area, most often containing components that should not be at risk of moving out of frame. The final and largest rectangle, also typically given a lighter hue or dotted touch, is another safe area, often containing things that move or exist beyond the primary frame, so that others on the pipeline, like background artists, compositors, and editors, have latitude for camera movements, slides, and other such movement changes for objects in the anime. Combining both the storyboard sense of how the shot is supposed to be composed with the background artist's details, it gives the key animator the last blueprint to begin properly animating. Other notes are often included in a layout as relevant pieces of information for the other art departments at the studio. The layout artist at times is the same person who also does the primary animating on the scene, but this is not always the case. At other times still, either the animation director or another prominent animator at the studio will be the person who handles the cut while someone else handles the layout. Though not always present, one aspect of layouts that might help down the road for animators is to include colored lines to indicate various properties within the drawings. Much like with the colored paper given by animation directors for corrections, there is no universal principle for which color is supposed to represent what. But generally speaking, it is understood industry-wide that black lines represent lines that are not supposed to disappear, while other colors like blue or red might mean that either a special color fill is needed, such as for the eyes or other highlights on a character, as well as divisions between light and dark. As long as the layout artist makes it clear what is supposed to mean what, it heads several questions the staff might have off at the pass. Corrections given to layouts often concern either the wrong coloring used or perspective consistency. So that's it, right? That's the layout portion? Well, no. As for why? Well, we need to address an infuriating nomenclature question that encompasses both differing word definitions and change in meaning over the course of anime's history. There is a term that you may have more than likely seen at some point: genga, or key animations, and how they factor into the discussion moving forward is going to matter a lot. Let's take the most general definition first. Genga refers to the animation itself at large, and translates most typically to original drawings. Technically speaking, genga refers to the entire key animation process. Key animation generally refers to the primary or important frames during the course of an animated sequence. Genga is generally divided between two phases. First key animations, also called Daiichi Genga or just Genga, yeah, I know, it's already more jumbled than it needs to be, and second key animations, or Daini Genga, also called Nigen for short. We'll delve into these in a moment, but something to know is that because of the increasing production crunch that has started consuming the modern anime industry, layouts and first key animations are often thrown into a blender and combined into the same step. Therefore, the split that is sometimes used to highlight the different phases of animation in cases like these is layout/genga and Nigen. As such, this makes layouts one of the aspects of the animation process that have undergone the most radical shifts compared to the days of old. Back in the pre-digital age especially, old layouts often were not animated, and used to be the first 2 or 3 main poses of a cut to demonstrate the structure of a shot. They're referred to as layouts because the original intent is to show the arrangement of the cut, to realize the most rudimentary and bare-bones way of envisioning how it's supposed to look or go beyond the small storyboard drawing. This was a model fully developed and realized by Takahata Isao directing Miyazaki Hayao in production for Heidi, Girl of the Alps. So when people say Miyazaki did X number of layouts in a day, it's not that he fully animated some scenes himself, but that he did the most skeletal work. It still doesn't take away from the sheer talent and maniacal commitment to realize it all, though. As time has gone on, however, the 2 to 3 drawings model has been abandoned. Why does this matter? Nowadays, layouts are a lot more detailed and more fully animated, blurring the line between layout and first key animations. On the surface, this doesn't sound so bad. Wouldn't this mean that there is one less step involved for anime production to have to deal with, therefore saving time and budget? Wouldn't the key animators' work therefore be more highlighted, and therefore they receive more credit for realizing that awesome cut from that show you like? In theory, this is correct. In practice, this opens up an entire host of new problems. The fragmentation of the anime process, especially as it has transpired over the past 10 years as the digital age has been more integrated into the whole industry, means that wires are getting crossed in where exactly the layout phase is supposed to fall or what exactly it's supposed to do. Remember, the intent of the layout was just to roughly realize the storyboard into a composed still image in TV scale, with all the storyboard's elements thrown in. The increase in TV aspect ratio from 4:3 to 16:9 and beyond is already extra details to contend with, but by rushing through this layout step, if not outright skipping it altogether and not being properly checked in advance by either the director, episode director, and animation director, it's a recipe for disaster. The key animator, and even the background artists, effects animators, and possibly even the sound effects engineers have far less foundation to continue their work, which means an increase in their workload that often leads to layout/first key animations that are poorly drawn or blandly realized because there was an effort to save time. This also means more time is spent addressing corrections which either the first key animator, or if they can't be contacted or are too swamped finishing another cut on another episode, the Negan animator must rectify, rather than doing simpler touch-ups. The paradox is that in a process that was intended to save time, time has been wasted in the present and will be wasted later. In other words, it's like trying to build a house when you haven't checked that the foundation is sturdy enough to support the weight. You're flirting with a ticking time bomb that's going to go off down the line, and you don't know what new problems are going to arise as a result of that. So, that's the layout phase. As it stands now in the industry at large, it's an absolute mess and increasingly vanishing as anime moves further forward. Famous animator, storyboarder, and now director Masuyama Ryoji, perhaps most known to current anime fans as the director for both seasons of Nier Automata, has a lengthy online guidebook for creating anime layouts. While it is in Japanese and Google Translate doesn't necessarily do the best job of converting it into English, I'm going to put it in the video's description because it's a great, generous resource from one of Studio Gainax's old giants. Key animations, or Daiichi Genga, or Genga, or Daini Genga, or Negan. But let's assume for a minute that you have your storyboard or old-fashioned style of layout sent to you by the production assistant, and it's time to get to work actually animating. You've read all the notes given to you about timing and where things are or are not supposed to go, so how do you start? To begin with, most animators using digital tools rather than paper and pencil often employ software like Clip Studio Paint or something similar. Because this tends to be the program of choice, it makes exchanging of materials between animators and production assistants, and then subsequently the other various departments, if not other studios, happen more cleanly. From this point, the animator will hopefully follow the approved storyboards and character sete as closely as possible when creating the perspective, character positioning, and the placement and general framework of special effects like beam blasts, lasers, impact frames, or explosions. As the cuts are being created, the animator may be in frequent contact with the production assistant if they need clarifications from another staff position on how things should be handled, or send early versions of their cuts for progress or corrections. You'll often notice that, if you take a still shot of some genga, there are numerous markings on the screen, various numbers paired with shapes. Breaking this down piece by piece, the letter represents the particular layer of the frame. Layer A represents the layer that is furthest away from the camera, and each subsequent letter down the line moves into the foreground by one layer. Depending on how intensive a scene might be with active involvement among the many layers, such as an action sequence which involves character hair or body parts flying around, among other effects like blood splatter, you'll find yourself drawing a lot of different layers to accommodate all the various movements you need. However, it's important to keep in mind that drawing too many layers makes things more difficult for later parts of the process like compositing, as those artists will have to assemble all these layers into finished images. Economizing your layers by placing things with similar timings on the same plane is thus a skill that key animators should develop over time, as too many layers can cause aggravations in compositing down the line. The numbers next to the letters indicate which frame number in the respective layer is being shown on the screen at that moment. The circles represent the keyframes, which tend to be the most important frames during the animation, and the triangles represent an in-between guide, or a breakdown of the frames that guide the motion from one keyframe to another. Think of it like this. Because triangles are such pointed polygons, they can be thought of as pointing out when more fluid movement is involved. Except for very rare instances, a character's lip flapping tends to be more implied as opposed to following each distinct lip, tooth, or tongue movement that your real mouth would ordinarily make when speaking. As just one example, animators may use a series of what might be called poses for the mouth, put in their own layer with the closed mouth being pose number 1 and the open mouth being shown with pose number 3. Pose number 2 is to be filled in by the in-between animator. More mouth poses might be used depending on the specificity required by the cut, which would likely be pointed out by the director and conveyed appropriately. Once the key animator has finished working on their respective cut, they then need to fill out this giant thing. This is a timesheet, and while a bit antiquated, it's a vital piece of communication between the key animators and the other departments to let them know what cut has been worked on and how it has been worked on, which the timesheet matches. Whether you are a current age layout animator or a key animator, as both positions need to fill them out, they provide a single place for anyone working on the cut to read the same instructions by the key animator. The timesheet being correct is critical, especially in regards to a director's checking and editing. Timesheets may vary from studio to studio, but they can be understood with a little time. The sections are the title, a memo for other production members like in-betweeners, layout artists, or compositing, the total time of the cut, the animator's name, the compositor's name, which the animator will not fill in, the genga column separated by its layers, a frame counter, a sound effects and dialogue column, a column for the in-betweener, a camera column, and a space to indicate which sheet number out of how many you are providing. If this sounds like a lot of clerical or secretarial work, that's because it is. But without properly filled in timesheets along with their respective cuts, it would be easy for parts to get lost or mistakenly shuffled around. Better communication at the onset helps prevent bad communication later. The notation that goes in the various genga columns should match what the genga has indicated with the letter, number, and shape of each frame so indicated. Other notations will vary, but oftentimes, vertical lines in the genga layers column means to hold the frame until the next keyframe or breakdown frame. Small slashes represent the in-between frames needed to smooth out the motion between breakdown frames. Timings on 1, 2s, and 3s are indicated by properly spacing things. This is important since, in anime, most drawings are usually held for 2 frames at a time within the 24 frames per second. The blank boxes indicate how long a frame is supposed to be held. Therefore, if a drawing is held for 1 frame, we say it's animated on 1s. Holding it for 2 frames means it's on 2s, and so on and so forth. Extremely important in the process for key animators is to let in-between animators know the timing of the cuts that they'll be filling in. In order to help with orchestrating timings, animators employ what's called tsumeshiji, or spacing and timing charts, in the genga and nigen, which are subsequently communicated in the timesheets. Spacing these charts appropriately, along with the arrow indicating which direction the movement is supposed to go, helps map the course of the cut and convey which in-betweens are supposed to convey faster or slower motion. As you might imagine, these timings can get pretty crazy, especially if you need to account for camera rotations, backgrounds, etc. As various parts of the production process are completed, the key animator may be sent assets to take into consideration for the construction of their cuts. It is, for instance, a lot easier to animate an action sequence that involves buildings when you've been sent the background layers. Because of the blurring between layouts and first key animations as a single step and second key animations or nigen, an obvious question that comes up is whether there is an easy way to tell the difference between these 2 steps. It's unfortunately a familiarity test more so than anything concrete, but one way that might help is amount of visual detail. Take this cut from the recent remake adaptation of Yaiba Episode 23 by Yugen R.B. The amount of detail between Onimaru and Yaiba is stark not only with the details of the actual clothes, but also the detail on the movement. Compared in this way, the steps between genga and nigen can be seen most clearly. As for why Onimaru is not as finished comparatively, I cannot say anything with complete certainty, but it's possible that Yugen RB felt more comfortable animating Yaiba's clothes and movement compared to Onimaru's metallic armor detail and movement. In a way, this makes sense. Yaiba's movement is more exaggerative, which means that non-realistic liberties can be taken in the drawings with expressive poses, which Kaneda Yoshinori helped pioneer in the 1970s. Therefore, the nigen for Onimaru would be handled by someone else, perhaps someone with more familiarity with working on metallic armor and smaller realistic movement, assuming this is where Yugen RB's contributions ended. We're sadly at the mercy of whatever production material is available for public release, and it's not always clear about who did what because of non-disclosure. In the midst of all this key animating, regardless of whether it's layouts or Negan, the key animator's work is constantly being sent by production assistants to the director, animation director, and chief animation director for checks and corrections. These can range from small things I mentioned before, like character details, to larger things like needing to extend the cut because someone miscalculated the length on a timesheet or storyboard, or needing to fix the overall perspective of the cut, among others. And while you're waiting to hear back on those, you're more than likely working on another cut for another episode later in the show's run. Remember, production assistants are usually helping on as many as 3 to 4 episodes at any given time, and since the staff are often shared between all the episodes that they're assisting with, assuming the staff are not freelanced, you'll be constantly hard at work on your own genga. And hey, maybe an episode that you aren't working on originally needs an extra animator, and while you're at it, why not take over on a cut because the original person meant to do the genga or Negan can't be reached? Anime production is a team effort, and everyone scrambles to get to the deadlines any way they can, come hell or high water. But you might just develop carpal tunnel in the process. I hope you have a sleeping bag at your desk, because you may not be going back to your apartment anytime soon. Sound, or onkyo. While the question of sound on the surface might seem like something that belongs in either production or post-production, I'm including it here because it's during animation that sound really becomes relevant. Contrary to how things are handled in the West, where animation is often done after the lines have been recorded and then must be matched, Japanese voice actors, or seiyuu, have to match the incomplete animation when it's time to record. Oftentimes, all of the seiyuu in an episode are in the studio at the same time as they record, and trying to get their schedules to align, whether through an agency or otherwise, is a necessary step. As the recording itself is overseen by the credited sound director or their own agency and sound team, it's not unheard of for seiyuu to record over layouts or even just the storyboards because there's no fuller animation done yet. Important to note also is that anime is often not recorded in individual sound booths. The seiyuu all share the same space and same set of microphones, moving to stand or sit as needed as they try to match lip flaps or non-existent lip flaps to the dialogue they've been given. Optimally, entire scenes are recorded rather than moving line by line, but as you might imagine, additional takes for certain lines will be needed since, well, nobody is perfect. Of course, complications arise in this process as well. If a seiyuu needs to come back because it was found that a certain timing did not work, or that a sound file got corrupted and needs to be done again, or some background dialogue needs to be done, it's right back into the booth at the seiyuu's earliest convenience. The question of sound effects naturally arises during this time. Because anime production at large has been a thing for the past 60 plus years, the wellspring of sounds that a production team has at their disposal can be massive, and that's not even getting into all the sounds from outside of anime either. In combination with the sound director, any credited sound effects person, or onkyo koka, has to either create sound effects from scratch or dig into the numerous sounds in a pre-made sound library to use in the production. Just as Western entertainment will sometimes use the Wilhelm scream, anime may use the same sounds because they produce the same needed impact or effect. It can be fun listening to sound effects from Slayers that were used in Dragon Ball, which were used in Fist of the North Star. In-between animator, or dolga. Assuming the best case scenario, once the genga and Negan have been properly corrected, the frames are sent off to the in-between animator, or dolga artist, to fill in all the space between the keyframes that the timesheet specified. It's important to point out that the term dolga in this case primarily translates to video, as it is the dolga artist that actually makes the sketches and drawings become fuller animation proper. Using the timing and spacing charts provided, dolga artists are told not only what needs to be animated, but when and where within the cut the in-betweens are placed. For scenes in which there is a certain amount of action, whether in terms of gigantic explosive spectacle or something as innocuous as characters shaking hands, timing and spacing charts make a world of difference in showing which actions are heavier than others, as well as how certain actions flow from one into another. Just as how an action has different ebbs and flows, doga sometimes requires ebb and flow of its own line work. You're not always going to want a line to be perfectly centered between two frames, and the smaller decisions like these make a huge difference in how a scene is interpreted and received. If you notice at times certain movements either seem unintentionally janky, appear to have too much movement from one frame to another, or that the lines seem to wobble during movement, which was the melting phenomenon people talked about with the television adaptation of Chainsaw Man, this is a sign that something has likely gone wrong with doga, either because the artist messed up, or the overall timing and spacing provided by the notes in the genga timesheets were not properly measured or calculated. What complicates the matter further is that doga is dependent on the genga being finished, or at least polished enough that the doga can start being drawn. If the genga animator is taking too long to even finish the rough cuts, or their work is continuously getting corrected because they aren't good enough, or the timesheet is wrong, or the animator just up and vanishes, or the production assistant is busy trying to help something else and can't get the genga to the artist in time, this seriously capsizes and hampers doga production, which hampers doga checks. You'll get the idea. It should be pointed out that doga work, despite how critical it is in anime's aesthetic, is often considered low-rung grunt work and pays some of the lowest wages. That's not to say that doing doga is somehow unimportant. Many major animators in the industry, both now and before, got their start doing doga work. While it involves having to follow someone else's instructions and thus does not allow for much creativity or expression within the doga artist to come through, it teaches consistency of line work, motion, perspective, and other ingredients through replication and recreation. The Kyoto Animation School follows a similar pattern. Before you can do genga, you have to learn doga. But aside from being perhaps spiritually unfulfilling, doga also comes with low recognition from the audience. On various sites like Sakugaboru, the genga animators or the people who did the corrections tend to be the staff given credit because doga is far less spotlighted in terms of who worked on what. Recognizable animators have patterns in their genga that can be discerned through practice or obsessive viewing. Such is not the case with doga. Doga, by its very nature, is supposed to blend in so as to seem almost invisible. Because of this, and because it is often given to the most inexperienced animators, doga can sometimes appear absolutely terrible. This is part of the reason why the recent controversy about the Sekiro trailer was so unfortunate. It's not that the trailer was using AI, but rather that what everyone was overreacting to was doga that they thought seemed awful, even though animation is not meant to be consumed frame by frame. While there are incentives to have automatic tools like Kakani handle doga work and thus potentially eliminate the role altogether, that's still hopefully a long way off. And if it should happen, aside from the obvious issue of axing numerous jobs, what's supposed to be the way in which new animators learn about how anime works creatively and industrially? Studios that would use tools like these would not care about training doga artists, while genga is an entirely different level of animation production, and throwing animators headfirst into that is already a problem that many freelancers, domestic or otherwise, face when trying to break into the industry themselves. Especially since freelancers are often not properly trained in the production pipeline and don't receive the most worthwhile feedback on their work from studio staff, if at all, it compounds the problem. Eliminating doga as a job effectively means a willingness to work with less able animators at the higher levels, and that can only yield even more problems in an industry already compounded with them. In-betweens check, or doga kensa. In-between check is more or less the doga equivalent of the animation director, monitoring the doga and catching those problems I mentioned before early on so they don't cause additional worse problems later. Finishing, or shiage. Part of the process that is absolutely vital, but not recognized or adequately paid in the final results, much like doga, is that of shiage. Once all the genga and in-betweens have been completed, it is during shiage that the color model sheets from the color coordinator and color designer are properly implemented into the final product. Essentially, anything that is not meant to be the same shade of white as the animation frames or cells are filled in properly. In addition, the multicolored lines during the animation creation phases are trace painted. This is most frequently done using the Retas Paintman HD software. Common problems that might occur with Shiage include colors being in the wrong place or inconsistent. In the old days of anime production pre-digital technology, the pencil drawings that were created by the genga and doga artists would be inked in a special process called xerography, which comes from the word Xerox. These drawings would be photocopied onto plastic cells, and the backsides would be painted using acrylic paints or similar. Because of the cell's transparencies, once the colors were dried, you could easily see the properly finished design on the front side. I mentioned before that Shiage artists tend to be overlooked and underpaid. The underpay matter is a general problem in the industry that impacts most animating process positions, but the overlooked component is at least somewhat due to the audience. Part of the reason why is that, like the best doga, if you don't notice that anything is wrong, that's a Shiage artist doing what they're supposed to do. Sadly, it's sometimes easier to notice when something looks wrong as opposed to looks right, so Shiage tends to get put into the spotlight when they've messed up. Finishing check, or Shiage Kensa. As you can infer from the name, finishing check is the position responsible for checking the Shiage to make sure that there are no glaring mistakes. Because Shiage is sometimes handled by outsourcing, numerous people or companies getting involved means numerous times that something could go wrong. Regardless of whether outsourcing is involved or not, it can lead to some rather unfortunate instances of either inconsequential or flat-out unpleasant mistakes. So while it might be fun to point out times where something color-wise falls apart in the final product, just remember that there were likely about 100 other mistakes that were caught before the broadcast happened. 3D CG, or CG Animator. 3D CG is highly nebulous, in part because it is so dependent on the specific production. 3D CG animators have to follow a very similar process to those doing genga and nigen with all that comes after, and the forces involved might require either a very small handful of animators if it's not too much 3D needed, to a whole studio. Productions that require heavier uses of 3D will likely have more individual credits for all the various contributions from rigging to animators to model design. Well, that's just about all for the animation portion, so now that we've got all that out of the way, let's move on to the final phase, post-production. Photography/compositing, or satsue. Although it is labeled in this case under post-production, photography and compositing takes place throughout the course of an episode's production period rather than at the end, but it is being included here since it is one of those final components that goes into an anime's finalization. I already mentioned that compositing is overseen by a director of photography, or satsue kantoku, who works in tandem with the compositing art department of the studio, the artists of which all have their own cuts that they're responsible for. Most of what comprises compositing can be given two general phases. First, there is what's called line photography, or line test, which begins in earnest as the department receives the early storyboards and layouts. This can best be thought of as the episode in its most finished state at the moment with the parts that the compositing department has compiled or assembled at that moment in Adobe After Effects, which the episode director is supposed to check for accuracy. Layering the cells, backgrounds, and other elements are done in accordance with the appropriate timesheets, which is why it's important that timesheets are accurate both in sequence and in timing, and any relevant camera movements needed for cuts are also done during this time. As the improved or final versions of the numerous cuts are received, regardless of which episode they're on, compositing takes the files and saves or overwrites the earlier files, which can then be distributed further if needed. Also a part of this portion of compositing is to take the post-trace Shiage and go through with anti-aliasing. Anti-aliasing is important since it means redrawing the lines so that they do not appear pixelated or jagged. If you've ever played a modern video game, some of them have a toggle effect in their visual settings with varying opacities to simulate different degrees of the same general principle. The second phase for compositing can be thought of as post-processing, even though that's not an official credit. Among the chief tasks are taking the files readied from line photography, creating and adding visual effects like blurs and smoke, line filters, light sources, gradients, color corrections, and saturations, sometimes based on the instructions given to the department. If you remember from the discussion about genga concerning timesheets and how animators have memos or notes to communicate with other departments, the same general idea applies here. Assuming their timesheet is accurate, which comp would have to rectify in case it isn't, the animator or storyboarder indicates any relevant special effects or details meant to go into the animation, which the compositing department is meant to finish with the genga's framework for it already completed. Notes can be specific, like saying that a few frames of something need a light flare for dramatic emphasis. Other times, it might be more generalized, like the light source in this scene is from the desk lamp, and how that appropriately fills the frame. Compositing is another process that has undergone many changes over the course of the decades. I mentioned back in the Director of Photography section that the term photography refers to when anime was filmed with actual rostrum cameras. In the old days, cell layers would be placed atop one another with the background on the bottom, for obvious reasons, and then piling atop as many layers as were needed to complete the shot. If you've ever wondered why older anime seems to have a slightly grainier or rustic look to it, it's the result of these sheets of almost completely transparent plastic cells physically assembled together without digital cleaning, along with the physical wear and tear of handling them and the quality of the rostrum cameras used. When a shot was complete, everything would be removed, the process repeated until completion, and the film roll would be chock full of thousands of these synthesized pieces. Modern anime obviously streamlined this for the compositing process, as now layers can be placed into digital files in the same software without dealing with nearly so much physical matter. But because there might be some notable visual differences between the various pieces of art in the layers, such as 2D characters against 3D backgrounds, just to list one example, compositing departments now have the task of adding filters to blur the lines between them. With all of these things taken into consideration, ideally, the compositing would take the inherent mood or tone of a scene and add in the filters or effects in order to make the image stronger, assuming that those things are needed. For Zutamayo's Study Me, for instance, the compositing incorporates an overall digital look by making its pixelation effects and the shapes in the drawings pop with their neon light, which makes sense given the context of the MV itself. Kentaro Waki's work in particular is worth highlighting here, as they're a compositor whose work has gained increased prominence in recent years. His work on Heavenly Delusion stands out immensely, properly adding blur and other details to make certain moments as punching or stylized as they need to be, or sometimes it's recreating a retro anime look through digital means. To put it another way, recognizing good compositing is being able to look at an image and see that it is not simply the moving animation or the individual sketch and drawing that's making it work, but being able to see all the tiny details that make a moment or sequence shine. As for the time that compositing doesn't work or goes poorly, unfortunately, a lot of this comes down to personal preference that does or does not happen to coincide with your own aesthetic sensibilities. There may be times that the wrong filters can really mess with a shot, a bad aliasing job doesn't get fixed, or a miscommunication results in an animator's in-between guide not being followed and the character vanishing, or sometimes an entire layer just up and vanishes. But the more likely result is that any supposed errors in comp are usually the result of errors, mistakes, or lateness from other departments. As such, decisions need to be made during production about how to overcome these problems, which can muddy where exactly mistakes do happen in compositing. Because of this, errors in the actual storyboards, layouts, animation, or overall color design get compounded by the time they reach compositing. And while compositing may help mask these problems, it cannot fix them completely. Much like with the director, episode director, and animation directors, compositing is also a job that involves frequently checking work to make sure that everything has gone swimmingly. Because compositing is the central hub for all files, they're doing as much checking of other departments' work as they are trying to polish and finish what they already have. Do the timesheets match what the compositing department has been sent, or is it a confusing mess that is unclear or, at worst, just flat out incorrect? Has the Shiage been completed satisfactorily, or does the compositing need to include a color or effect that Shiage forgot to account for? Or, if not that, does the production assistant need to be contacted to communicate these corrections or changes to the relevant departments? And remember, since compositing departments are working on numerous episodes at one time, the amount of coordination that goes into this part of the animating process flow properly is crucial. You can't risk losing time by misplacing or forgetting to send a file, or sending the wrong file. I know that I've been harping on this many times throughout the course of the script, but communication is what makes this all work in the end. If communication breaks down at some point in the pipeline, it will impact the compositing department's ability to work efficiently. 2D works / 2D design, or 2D wakusu or 2D design. 2D works is a credit that, while perhaps not seen as frequently or commented upon much, goes a long way in the verisimilitude of an anime scene. The position often refers to someone who works on special graphics materials that are extraneous and helping to integrate them into the scene in a believable way. Things like book covers, wall art in an apartment that isn't part of the original background art, or perhaps even a character looking at their phone messages are covered by 2D works. But for mecha fans especially, 2D works can best be understood through the creation and integration of user interfaces for their settings, or other large screen monitors. Sometimes given the credit monitor graphics or monita graphics, they add the special ingredient that makes a giant robot seem more like a giant robot. Editing, or henshu. As the various parts of the compositing process are officially completed, as well as the seiyuu performances with the sound director, the editor has to take all the components of the episode, from the audio to the video, and edit them together into what will become the finished episode. As the components are assembled, the editor and their team, if they have one, work alongside the director, and might find that there are certain aspects that need to be either extended or trimmed for the sake of the broadcast, since, minus the OP and ED, they only have about 22 minutes on average. While the genga timesheets and storyboards would normally account for hashing out all timings in advance, things like the addition of the music or other problems might arise naturally through the course of episode development. These problems are identified and, God forbid, the process of animating or line recording has to start all over again in order to get the edits finished. In a worst-case scenario, decisions will need to be made about how to edit together a recap episode, which itself might involve new production tasks. When the final checks are completed, the episode is sent off to the broadcasting company for the eventual airing, and a copy is retained for the studio staff to watch themselves. This copy is called the shirobako, hence the name of the anime, even if it's rarely being kept in a physical form like a white-cased DVD disc or VHS casing of old. Conclusion. Phew, that was a lot, wasn't it? But hey, congratulations! You've successfully completed a single episode of an anime, and now you know what every major staff position on a project does. Everything is going to be A-OK. Except that you now have to do this at least 11 more times to finish the run, and you've also been working on several episodes at the same time. While I've touched upon this in the Age of Delays video I posted beforehand, the reality of anime production is that most shows are not actually finished by the time they air, as there are usually only about 4 episodes, if even that, fully ready by the time it hits the premiere date. Anime studios work furiously behind the scenes to give the illusion that things are running smoothly, when in actuality, most studio staff are overworked and exhausted, balancing numerous schedules and possibly doing work for more than one studio. It is not uncommon for an episode to be finished mere hours before it airs, and with the sheer amount of stress that's involved, it is no wonder that so many newcomers, regardless of which department they belong to, leave the industry after only a few years. Not helping with that is the meager pay. I've hit on this several times before with Doga and Shiage, but unless you happen to work at a studio like Kyoto Animation or get recruited to work on something popular enough that it factors into the pay you receive, you shouldn't expect to make that much money. Fact is, people do not necessarily work in anime because they want to make money. A New York Times article by Ben Dooley and Hida Hikari from February 2021 highlighted that an animator only receiving about $1,400 a month in pay is common, which compounds the already deep stress of just trying to get one's work done, let alone how to live when you aren't sleeping in the studio overnight to put in your 3rd straight day of overtime eating bento boxes from the Family Mart next door. Freelance animators especially have it rough. Because they are hired freelance instead of being employed by the studio, it gives the studio an excuse to pay them even less money. And it's important to remember that they're paid by the cuts that they're tasked with doing, not royalties from the anime selling Blu-rays or ad revenue. So, with everything that I've explained in the course of this video, why would anyone want to work on this stuff when there are other money-making ventures that could be found? Why trade so much economic and social freedom and personal health for the sake of drawing? The reason why is the same reason that anime has the fanbase that it does. Doga, genga, sete artists, shiage, compositors, and everyone else get into anime because they love animation and hope to make the best project that they can in the time that they have with the restrictions imposed upon them. They do it out of passion and heart, come rain or shine. Either that, or they think that they just don't have any other marketable skills. Sometimes it pays off in a series that you'll think about for the rest of your life. Other times, it's a show that sadly fades into the recesses of your memory as that thing you watched in some season from some year with some character whose name you can't even recall. What I hope has been most clear from this video is not only clarifying who works on what during the course of anime production, but to also put into perspective how many moving pieces are actually involved in the creation of it, both from the directorial side and from those who have to create the animated images that we consume every day. So the next time that you watch an anime, regardless of whether you love or hate it, take the time to step back and appreciate all that Japanese text you see in the OP and the ED, and just how much is needed to make that come true. Each of those credits is a name that helped make the thing you just saw, even if you can't quite know who worked on what. Learning how they did it might not solve the industry's problems, or the problems of the production you just witnessed, but a little more understanding of how the process works can go a long way in not only diagnosing what is going wrong with an anime, but also help articulate what is going right. There's only so much that we can do as global anime fans. Compared to Japanese audiences who are always first and foremost the intended audience for anime, our ability to make meaningful change is near non-existent. In this case, information and education is our greatest asset. I hope that this video serves as a worthwhile first step, and that it's the sort of thing you would want to share for anybody who may possibly want to know more about how the anime industry works. Wherever your anime journey takes you next, you'll have a little more understanding as to what goes on with making the things we love. A special thank you to Aaron Rodriguez and May, whose discussions over the years helped inspire this video, as well as checking the script for accuracy. A special thank you to my patrons. And a thank you for watching. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe, click the bell for notifications so you don't miss an upload, donate to my Patreon, or follow my social media accounts. Links provided in the video's description. In the meantime, this has been ZNote of ZNoteTaku. Happy viewing, everyone!